Turn that on. Okay, here we go.
This is Satellite Bible Atlas video number 7, commentary for maps 110 and 111, the Shephelah of Judah. The Shephelah of Judah is a buffer region between the hill country of Judah and the coastal plain.
This is the Shephelah! The Shephelah is the main point of conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites.
The word Shephelah means foothills or lowlands. The foothills are bisected by wide valleys. The foothills protect the western side of the hill country of Judah. Here is an aerial photograph of the Elah Valley in the Shephelah. For security reasons, cities and towns were built on the hills. The ruins of the biblical town of Azekah are on this hill, while the routes ran in the wide valleys bisecting the hills. The Shephelah has rich agriculture, especially from trees, like grapevines, sycamore and olive trees. Grains and vegetables grow in the rich soil of the valleys. Note the elevation of the Shephelah, tucked between the coastal plain and the hill country. At around 1,300 feet above sea level, the Shephelah is approximately half the height of the hill country. Find the Shephelah on map 12.3. Here is the relatively flat coastal plain. To the east, the higher, rugged hill country. Situated between them, about 40 miles long and 8 miles wide, is the Shephelah. Note the routes in the wide valleys that divide the foothills. On map 110, take a look at the coastal plain. The Philistines settled as a nation here in about 1200 BC. The main cities of the Philistines were situated along the two branches of the International Coastal Highway. Along the coastal branch are Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. Along the inland branch of the highway were Gath and Ekron. Note the hill country of Judah to the east, and the buffer zone Shephelah. Now let's examine the Shephelah valleys and routes. Map 111 is a close-up of the Shephelah of Judah region. On the map, shaded in darker green, are 5 wide valleys that run predominantly east to west, connecting the hill country to the coastal plain. An earlier video examined how the wide Ajalon Valley, the northernmost Shephelah Valley, functions as the main route from the coast to Jerusalem. The route was guarded by the city of Gezer in the Shephelah Hills. The next valley, running parallel but south of the Ajalon, is the Sorek Valley. Note the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol on the north side of the Sorek Valley, where the Spirit of the Lord first moved upon Samson. Across the valley to the south is the important town of Bet Shemesh. To the west is Timnah, and near where the Sorek opens into the coastal plain is the Philistine town of Ekron. Like the Ajalon, the Sorek Valley is an east-west route, connecting the Philistine plain to the hill country. From near Bet Shemesh and Eshtaol, routes into the rugged hill country travel on ridges. Let's take a look at the Sorek Valley from the ruins of ancient Bet Shemesh.
We're standing here at Bet Shemesh overlooking the Sorek Valley. It was along the Sorek Valley that the Ark of the Covenant returned from the Philistines to Judea. Also behind me you can see the town of Zorah. This is where the Spirit of the Lord first moved upon Samson. It was Samson, you'll recall, who later was able to kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey.
Map 4.8 shows that many of the events in the life of Samson occurred in the Sorek Valley. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson between Zorah and Eshtaol. He killed a lion on a journey to Timnah. The lion had probably come up out of the thickets of the Sorek River, which runs through the valley. Note the proximity of Zorah to Timnah, where Samson saw a Philistine gal.
We're at the biblical town of Timnah, where Samson saw a Philistine girl that he wanted to marry.
The Sorek Valley is the setting for the return of the Ark of the Covenant to Judah. The Philistines had captured the Ark in a battle at Aphek and brought it to their city Ashdod. The Philistines, like so many others through the ages, believed they had subdued the God of Israel, but they were wrong. The Ark was sent to Gath and then to Ekron. from where 2 cows pulled it on a cart straight up the Sorek Valley to Bet Shemesh. From Bet Shemesh, it was brought up to Kiryat Jearim in the hill country, where it stayed 20 years until Samuel led Israel in a national repentance. South of the Sorek Valley is the Elah Valley. Note the cities of Azekah, Soko, and Adullam. To the west, where the Elah Valley spills into the coast, is Gath, home of the giant Goliath. Between Azekah and Soko, on the north side of the Elah Valley, is a ruin called Khirbet Kiyafa, where recent excavations have exposed an ancient Israelite town, perhaps dating to either King Saul or David. Let's take a look at the Elah Valley looking east from Azekah.
We're at the ancient site of Azekah, looking out over the Elah Valley. This is where the Philistines were encamped when David fought Goliath, between Azekah and Soko.
And now from Soko, looking back west.
We're at Soko in Judah. Behind me on the hill is Azekah. The Philistines encamped between Soko and Azekah, this side of the Elah Valley, when David fought Goliath.
This is the brook in the Elah Valley where David would have come down to collect his 5 stones before going to fight Goliath.
Yeah!
As map 5.3 shows, David fought Goliath in the Elah Valley. Again, the Shephelah proved to be the buffer zone where Philistines battled Israelites. We suggest the battle occurred just below Soko. The victory confirmed that David was chosen by God to be king in Israel, and that the God of Israel saves neither by the sword nor spear. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled on the road of Sha'araim to Gath and Ekron. The next valley in the Shephelah is today called the Guvrin Valley. Note the towns of Mareshet Gath and Maresha. The prophet Micah lived in this region. The cities in the southern Shephelah are important for confronting enemies from Egypt. King Asa of Judah learned that the Lord could be trusted when a huge attacking army was routed, turned, and fled at Maresha. Because of the wickedness of King Ahaz of Judah, the prophet Micah witnessed Philistine incursions into the Shephelah. But Micah said this was just the beginning of difficulties. Israel and Judah's real trouble would come from mighty Assyria. On map 110, note one more valley in the Shephelah, last but not least. Here is one of Judah's most important cities, Lachish. Ancient Lachish covers over 30 acres. As seen on map 3.6, Canaanite Lachish was conquered by the Israelites under Joshua. Map 7.7 shows how Lachish played a role in one of the most dramatic interventions of the Lord on behalf of Jerusalem. The event is described in 3 books of the Bible, Kings, Chronicles, and Isaiah.
This is Lachish, Tel Lachish, the city where Sennacherib of Assyria conquered in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah.
The mighty empire of Assyria, under King Sennacherib, around 700 BC, controlled the entire ancient Near East to the border of Egypt. Tiny Judah, under King Hezekiah, decided to revolt from Assyrian rule. Sennacherib came to subdue Hezekiah. The Assyrians first secured the coast, then began sieging the buffer zone Shephelah, especially Lachish. Sennacherib boasted of making Hezekiah a prisoner in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Sennacherib was particularly proud of his conquest of Lachish. He decorated a large room in his palace in Nineveh, depicting the siege and conquest of the city. Here Sennacherib is depicted with an inscription that reads, "Sennacherib, king of Assyria, king of the universe, seated on his throne as the booty of Lachish comes before him." But then the Lord dramatically intervened in the affairs of men. In response to the faith of Isaiah and Hezekiah, and as evidence that the God of Israel is the Lord of all, the angel of the Lord decimated 185,000 Assyrian troops in one night. Sennacherib retreated to his capital in Nineveh, where later his own sons killed him. 110 years after the Assyrian attempt to conquer Judah, the Babylonian Empire tried to do the same. This time, there was no divine protection for Judah. Like Assyria, Babylon had to conquer the buffer zone Shephelah to reach Jerusalem. The cities of Azekah and Lachish appear in both the biblical and archaeological record.
We're standing here in the gate room of Lachish, where some potsherds were found mentioning the two cities Azekah and Lachish. Now these are the same two cities mentioned by the prophet Jeremiah, and they were the only two ones left standing when the Babylonians sieged Judah.
With the cities of the buffer zone Shephelah conquered, Babylon stepped up into the hill country and destroyed Jerusalem. To review, note on map 111 a route that runs north-south through the Shephelah. It's called the diagonal route. It runs from the city of Ajalon to Eshtaol and Bet Shemesh in the Sorek Valley, then to Azekah in the Elah Valley, through Bet Guvrin to Lachish. Then take a look at map 6.1, which shows the fortifications of Solomon's son Rehoboam. Many of these towns will sound familiar now. You can understand better why Rehoboam fortified the towns in the Shephelah: Ajalon, Zorah, Gath, Azekah, Sokau, Adullam, Mareshet Gath, Maresha, and Lachish. The writer of Chronicles records that these fortresses did Rehoboam no good when he forsook the word of the Lord.
We're at Soko, where the giant Goliath probably taunted the Israelites who are standing over there.
Behind us is the hill that has the ruins of Gath, which is the hometown of Goliath the Philistine.
We're at the caves of Adullam, where David hid from Saul.
Very nice.
Okay. Yeah, they're kind of cute. Okay, where's here we go. I guess everyone can see that?
Yep.
The map? Okay. Now, not much later after the Israelites began their conquest of Canaan, another nation began its assault on what was the Egyptian province of Canaan, and that nation was the Philistines. The Philistines were from Aegean stock and were related to both the Minoan and the Mycenaean people of the Mediterranean islands and mainland Greece, and in later day classical Greeks. They belonged to a family of sea peoples that swept down the shores of the southeastern Mediterranean. Their mode of operation resembled that of the later Norsemen and the Vikings. In the early 12th century BC, the sea peoples attempted to conquer Egypt, and it was only after a major effort that Pharaoh Ramesses III succeeded in breaking their assault in a long, drawn-out and bloody sea battle in the Delta around 1190 BC. It was after that encounter that the Philistines seemed to have come to some kind of agreement, and they settled with the blessings of the Pharaonic authorities on the southwestern shores of Canaan. At first, they not only accepted Egyptian sovereignty, but they served as garrisons to the pharaohs in their last attempts at trying to conquer Palestine and include Palestine in their domain prior to the final Israelite takeover. But soon Egypt's power started to diminish, and the Philistines became virtually independent, and they started to push out of the plain of southern Judah in order to guarantee themselves ample farmland. And it was in this endeavor where they began to clash with the Israelites, who were attempting to gain a foothold in the same region. The Israelites had already occupied the western strategic gates to both the Judean mountains and the Judean foothills, the Shephelah. It was here that the tribe of Dan, and you can see Dan depicted up here on the map, the tribe of Dan faced the Philistines directly. The Shephelah was the setting of the exploits of Samson, whose final downfall reflected the temporary ascendancy of the Philistines. In Judges, chapters 13 through 16, you can read all about that later. I won't ask anybody to read it now, but chapter 13 talks about the birth of Samson. Chapter 14 talks about Samson's marriage. Chapter 15 talks about Samson's vengeance on the Philistines. And finally, chapter 16 is about Samson and Delilah and the death of Samson. So you could read all of that on your own. But as you can see, this is where most of the events occurred. He was born here, where it says number 1. If I zoom in a little bit, he was born here. Women of Timnah. Here's where he kills the lion. Over here in Ashkelon is where he kills 30 Philistines. Let's see. Here the Philistines burn his wife, and Samson burns their fields. And then he kills 1,000 Philistines. Where is it? Oh, right here. He kills 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone. Down here in Gaza, he's with a harlot. He goes from Gaza to Hebron, which is located way over here. Keep in mind, these aren't great distances anyway. He meets Delilah in the Sorek Valley here. And then back in Gaza, he becomes a prisoner and dies there, but he's buried back near where he was born. Okay. Let's share this one. Okay. While in most of Palestine, the Israelites were victorious, by the middle of the 11th century, there were some signs as the Philistines began to master ironsmiths, and they provided their warriors with iron weapons, which the Israelites almost totally lacked. And this happened during the time of Samuel, who was a priest, prophet, one of the judges. The very loose tribal league of the Israelites proved that they were not capable of fighting against any concerted effort put forth by the Philistines. They couldn't hold the Philistines back as an independent, loose tribal coalition. So in spite of the Israelite victories under Samuel, such as the Second Battle of Ebenezer in his latter days, we find that the Philistines had established themselves in the heart of the Judean mountains. And you can read about the Battle of Ebenezer in the first book of Samuel, chapter 7. A permanent Philistine garrison was stationed in the stronghold at Gibeah. Gibeah is located right here. You may remember from a previous lesson where Joshua had made an alliance with the Gibeonites. But now the Philistines were firmly encamped in a fortress here at Gibeah, 3 miles north of Jerusalem, which is an easy striking distance of both the western and the southern slopes of northern Judah and Benjamin. The Israelites had lost a lot of their former self-confidence, which is one of the mainsprings of their victories up until that time. Rich, you got the first reading?
Yeah. When the Philistines heard that Israel was meeting at Mizpah, the Philistine leaders went on the offensive. Israel got the report and became frightened. Philistines on the move again. They pleaded with Samuel, pray with all your might and don't let up. Pray to God, our God, that he'll save us from the boot of the Philistines.
So it seems that the Philistines had achieved some kind of control in Judah, as the forging of iron was reserved to them alone. Jeff, you got the second reading?
Yep. Let me just get to the page. Samuel 13, 19 to 20.
Right.
Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. But all of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man's share, and his coulter, and his axe, and his mattock. I had to look those words up. I had no idea what they meant.
Oh, well, they're basically picks and shovels and plowshares. So they didn't have the ability to handle iron works. So the Israelites were dependent on the Philistines to have their tools kept in order and sharpened, because they didn't have the ability to do it.
Right.
Okay, switching maps here. This general state of weakness was naturally exploited by Israel's neighbors east of the Jordan as well. And shortly after, when the Judean mountains, which was Israel's heartland west of the Jordan, was penetrated by the Philistines, Gilead decided to get into the act, the Israelite heartland to the east of the river. And it came under similar pressure from the Ammonites, located here. There exists a great historical truism, and that is that the fortunes of nations are often shaped by their ability to stand up to challenges by breaking with their conventional methods of conducting affairs. And against the warnings and advice of Samuel, who wanted to maintain the existing order of the old Israelite political ideal of a theocratic, democratic, tribal confederation. But the tribal leaders remain adamant in their demand for a change. Janet, you got the next one?
Yes. We too must be like other nations, with a king to rule us and to lead us in warfare and fight our battles.
Yeah, so the people were saying, look, we need one king. It's the only way this is going to work. So in bowing to the healthy instincts of the people for a permanent and single leader in war, and by necessity also in peace, Samuel tried to choose the right leader, one who the unruly and the independent Israelite tribes would accept, even after their initial, happiness or elation of having their way had worn off. His choice fell on Saul, mainly because he was not just a good person and one who was taller than most, but because he was from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest of the 12 tribes, hoping to neutralize the rivalry of the large ones. Back to you, Rich.
Yep. There was a man from the tribe of Benjamin named Kish. He was the son of Abiel, grandson of Zerah, great-grandson of Bechorath, great-grandson of Abiah, a Benjamite of stalwart character. He had a son, Saul, a most handsome young man. There was none finer. He literally stood head and shoulders above the crowd.
So we're reminded much of the much later choice of the insignificant House of Habsburg to assume the throne of the German Empire, following much of the same reasoning that Samuel used here when he selected Saul. Unfortunately for Saul, who turned out to be one of the most tragic heroes of the Old Testament, Samuel's strategy only succeeded in part, and much of the internal unrest towards the end of Saul's reign, as well as his quarrels with David and his later succession to power, can be understood against the backdrop of this constant rivalry among the 12 tribes. They just couldn't seem to get along. And the second reason for choosing Saul as Israel's first anointed king, Samuel chose one from a tribe that suffered more directly than any of the others, and because it was constantly plagued by constant presence of Philistine occupation force on its territory, which gave Saul the strongest motivation. Saul's first concern, however, was in the east. The town of Jabesh Gilead, located here, had been under Ammonite siege for some time, and unless aid came quickly, its defenders were ready to submit to Nahash, who was the king of Ammon, and this would permit a hostile settlement right in the midst of Israelite Transjordan. So immediate action was clearly indicated, but the particularisms of the tribes was already demoralizing and so widespread that Saul found it necessary to use the threat of a special economic punishment to compel all the able-bodied men to join the national host. So back to you, Jeff.
Samuel 11:7. And he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel by the hands of the messengers, saying, Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one constant.
Okay, so the threat worked, and 330,000 men were mustered at the town of Bezek, located right here. Incidentally, we have here a number with the ring of authenticity, which also allows us to estimate or calculate the total population of ancient Israel about this time. And that was estimated to be 750,000. The number 330,000 for the actual muster, never mind the force that went out to battle, is of course vastly inflated. It has to be understood that 330,000 is more likely to be the total male population above the age of 16 or so, which brings us to the estimate of 750,000 for the general population. Now on this, a conscription or draft of 10% is the maximum a well-organized community is able to turn out, which is a number comparable to modern times. So in Saul's initial campaigns, no more than half that number, say about 16,500, would have made up the first army under Saul. The details of the relief of Jabesh Gilead are not given in the Bible, but the well-known ingredients of Israelite tactics are all there. A swift approach by quick night march, a division of forces, this time into 3 independent formations, the surprise to the unsuspected enemy, and the enemy's subsequent rout. The relief of Jabesh Gilead came right in the nick of time, and the lesson learned from that campaign was there's definitely a need for a constantly armed force ready for immediate action at the direct disposal of the king, to be strengthened by the tribal reservists or contingents as quickly as they could be mobilized. So accordingly, Saul created the first nucleus of a standing army by choosing 3,000 men to serve with him permanently. This force was divided into 2 formations. The smaller one of 1,000 men was commanded by his eldest son, Jonathan, whose first major exploit was the conquest of Gibeah. Down here, since we're on a different map, the conquest of Gibeah. Jonathan's action was a major threat to the Philistine control of the Judean heartland. Consequently, a large Philistine expeditionary force, including chariots, perhaps even a cavalry corps, was dispatched to reimpose their authority and to put down the Israelite attempt at establishing an independent kingdom. After moving through the Beth Horon Pass, located here, the Philistines moved into Michmash. And you recall from, again, previous videos that this area in between Michmash and Geba was a narrow pass, and Michmash guarded the north entrance and Geba guarded the south entrance. Here's Gibeah here that was under siege. The newly regained confidence of the Israelites after the relief of Jabesh Gilead was again shattered by this prompt action by the Philistines. And although Saul had wisely chosen the difficult to traverse Judean desert as the concentration area for the tribal conscripts, the reservists, a general disintegration of the Israelite forces began even before their first contact was made with the enemy. Accordingly, according to the first book of Samuel, chapters 13 and 14, Saul took up a position opposite Michmash at Geba with only 600 men, after it had been secured by Jonathan, 1,000 regular troops. The Philistines must have had some reliable intelligence about the quarrel, the open fighting between King Saul and the priest judge Samuel, and probably had some intelligence about the many desertions and the large numbers of population fleeing the area into Transjordan. Consequently, they decided to accelerate their destruction of the new kingdom by dispatching 3 flying columns to devastate the countryside all over the Central Plateau. To counteract the weakening of their forces that was guarding the pass, the Philistines kept a blocking force at the passage of Michmash, that saddle that connects Michmash and Geba and the western branch of the Watershed Road. So Saul did not dare attack even this weakened Philistine camp's blocking force, but hoping to mitigate the extent of the enemy's raids into the Israelite countryside, he moved his forces out of Geba and into a position directly opposite Michmash. Jonathan used this state of affairs for a daredevil strategy by sheer audacity promised success. Accompanied solely by his shield bearer, he made a wide detour to the south, and he suddenly appeared to the men of the Philistine blocking force as a man totally unconnected with the Israelite forces at the pass. I mean, it's like, oh, look, over here. Where did this guy come from? And what he did was he appeared to come out of his hiding place and attend to, quote, private matters in full view of the Philistine blocking force. Well, of course, the Philistines, they didn't budge, but they hurled insults at him. Oh, look, he's coming out of his hiding place. They shouted insults. The Hebrews have come forth out of their holes where they have hidden from us. And the 20-odd soldiers who made up the blocking force just returned their attention back to the larger force that was facing them in the pass. So let's see, who's next? Janet, I think you're next. 1 Samuel 14:11.
Accordingly, the 2 of them appeared before the outpost of the Philippines, who said, "Look, some Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have been hiding."
Oh, okay. Well, I said that.
I know.
So Jonathan and his shield bearer then disappeared into the deep gorge of the Wadi Suanit. And when they reached the cliff near the Philistine positions, Jonathan climbed up with his shield bearer following, and by their sudden assault from behind, both men were able to slay a considerable number of this utterly surprised enemy outpost and beat the rest into a wild retreat. Back to you, Rich.
Okay. Jonathan shouted to his armor bearer, "Up, follow me. God is turning them over to Israel." Jonathan scrambled up on all fours, his armor bearer right on his heels. When the Philistines came running up to them, He knocked them flat, his armor bearer right behind, finishing them off, bashing their heads with stones.
So this in turn surprised the garrison of Michmash, so that they mistook their own retreating soldiers as charging Israelites, and general confusion and subsequent panic followed that. So Saul put this confusion to good use and ordered a general frontal assault by the 600 remaining on Michmash. The enemy resistance broke immediately. Cut off from their straight line of retreat, the Philistines fled first in a northerly direction towards Bethel, and only then did they turn westwards. And all along the way, the Israelite farmers came out of their hiding places to which they had escaped from the enemy's raiding parties that were ravaging the countryside, and they brought havoc down on the fugitives. This was rather like what happened to the French in Spain during the Peninsular War in 1808, and to the British in Afghanistan in 1842, where more Philistines must have died during the retreat than during the actual previous battle. So in retrospect, there's no doubt that the Battle of Michmash was one of the most decisive in Israelite history, and that it was Jonathan's two-man action which paved the way for the victory that gave Saul the necessary relief he was looking for from his most dangerous enemies, and enabled him to establish a unified royal kingdom over most of both Cis and Transjordan. Jeff, you're next.
So Saul took the kingdom over Israel and fought against his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines, and whoever he turned himself, he vexed them.
Okay, thanks. Looking at this map, one of the chief, although unwritten, tenets of geopolitics governing Cisjordan has always been that whoever wants to provide peace and security to those that are living on the farmland must fend off the inroads of the nomads roaming the desert, down here in the Negev, for example. Oh, probably zoomed in too far. Here we go. There it is, down here in the Negev. Consequently, it was naturally Saul who began the continuous defense of the borders of the desert, which was later to be based upon a closely woven network of strong fortifications that lasted from Solomonic times all the way to the Middle Ages, well over 1,000 years. No details remain of Saul's war against the Amalekite nomads in the Negev. Similarly, his frequent campaigns against the never completely subdued Philistines are also lost to obscurity. The battlefield was most probably the Shephelah, and more particularly the mouth of one or another of those valleys that cut across, that led out of the mountain bastion down onto the plains. A typical example was the Battle of the Valley of Elah in the Shephelah. The Israelite army had by that time adopted the construction of well-organized, semi-permanent, and possibly fortified camps as bases for prolonged campaigns. By pitching their camp in the valley, they effectively barred the advance of the Philistines up into the mountains. The camp was well organized, with special zones for training, for ordnance and supply, which were overseen by special details. In spite of these improvements, however, the Israelite army was still inferior to the Philistines in armament of all kinds, and it completely lacked chariots. Consequently, Saul bided his time and knew better than to push out onto the open plain. This was the background of the famous duel between David and Goliath, the giant champion of the Philistines, who was dressed out in his full Homeric style armor, daily challenged the Israelites to a trial of arms. David's single-handed action caused panic among the Philistines. And again, as he had at Michmash, Saul used that critical moment to launch a general assault and rout the enemy. The Philistines were again beaten, but not crushed. In the ensuing years, when again these intertribal rivalries among the Israelites started to come into play again, disputes between Saul and Samuel and the break between Saul and David did a whole lot to weaken the recently unified nation. And during that time, the Philistines gathered their strength and plotted their revenge. Going to take you back to this map that you saw earlier. And the Philistines, their time came after the death of Samuel. The Philistine army assembled at Aphek, located here in the Shephelah, but their plan was to try a new approach.
We're not seeing a map.
After there are many I'm sorry?
We're not seeing a map.
Oh, sorry. I thought I shared it. How's that?
Okay.
Come on. That one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is one you saw earlier. The Philistines gathered here at Aphek, and their plan was to try a new approach. After their many unsuccessful attempts to penetrate the central mountain massif from the west, the Philistines planned a major enveloping movement by marching northwards along the plain of Sharon, the coastal plain, and then through one of the passes into the Jezreel Valley, most likely the Megiddo Pass, so as to enter the central mountain massif and then move southwards along the plateau. While maneuvering in the Jezreel Valley, the Philistines hoped that they would gain support from all these Canaanite cities which had not yet been captured by the Israelites. They were hoping for backup there. Saul had the advantage of interior lines. Accordingly, he waited to see what direction the Philistines would move. And after he was sure of their intentions, he moved his forces parallel to theirs along the plateau and then took up a blocking position that flanked the ascent into the lower foothills of Mount Gilboa here. Okay, gonna jump back to this map. So the question then becomes, why? Let me move this map down here. The question becomes, why was there no attempt to block the Philistine passage through that narrow Megiddo Pass? And the answer can be inferred from the choice of Aphek, located here on this map, on the north edge of the map, as the assembly point for the Philistines. By convening on Aphek, the Philistines posed a direct threat into the Judean mountains, which must have caused Saul to detach at least some of his observation forces to guard all the western approaches. And there's no mention of any planned Philistine diversionary movement, obviously, as such a move would appear to a modern commander. However, there was a report of a Philistine detachment and troop movement, which, however unintentional on the part of the Philistines, must have misled the Israelite troops. And you can read all about this in the first book of Samuel, chapter 29. David's return march from Aphek here down to Ziklag, which was David's home base, led past some of the most obvious invasion routes into Judah, such as the Valley of Elah and the Valley of Sorek, which must have kept Saul's men on their guard. And then only after certifying that he was not going to be stabbed in the back by David, he then rushed north to block the passage. Of course, they had already moved through the passage unmolested into the Jezreel Valley. So they weren't able to get there in time because they were so concerned. Now, this was during the time when David broke with Saul and essentially became a mercenary for the Philistines. A lot of people don't realize that, but David at one time went over to the Philistines and took all of his men with him, and they essentially became paid mercenaries. So it was during this time that David moved his small force from Aphek back down to Ziklag, and that caused the delay in moving north. Okay. Now we're going to go back to this map. So the outcome of the ensuing battle was decided by the Philistine chariots here at Mount Gilboa. Saul was forced to retreat up Mount Gilboa, but even there his position became untenable. The chariot-mounted Philistine archers followed close on his heels up the easily traversable western slope and subjected the Israelites who were on top on a flat plateau to constant effective fire. When Saul was convinced that all was lost, he chose to fall on his sword rather than be captured by his enemy. For the moment, it seemed that the Philistine goal had been achieved at last, and that the Israelite kingdom would be broken up again into its tribal components. But the Philistine triumph was short-lived. The years of Saul's reign had taught the tribes that only if they stayed unified and strong, and all the economic advantages that came with it, would they succeed. And David, who quickly became the new focus of attention, used the story of Saul and his son's death to revive the spirits of the Israelites. His lamentation for Saul and Jonathan, whose explicit purpose was to arouse the soldierly spirit of the children of Judah to renew their struggle for freedom, has survived as one of the most moving and stirring elegies in world literature. David's words did much to rekindle Israel's energy and hope, although his initial rule may have been under some kind of Philistine overlordship. So who's got the last verse? Janet?
Yes. Okay, this is quite lengthy.
Yeah, it's 10 verses, 17 to 27.
Okay.
But this is a famous lamentation, and there's been some fantastic musical compositions that have been created around the lamentation of Saul and Jonathan. Beautiful stuff.
Okay. I'll try and do it justice.
Okay.
That would not be doing it justice. Then David chanted this elegy for Saul and his son Jonathan, which is recorded in the book of Jashar to be taught to the Judahites. He sang, "Alas, the glory of Israel, Saul, slain upon your heights. How can the warriors have fallen? Tell it not in Gath, herald it not in the streets of Ascalon, lest the Philistine maidens rejoice, lest the daughters of the strangers exult. Mountains of Gilboa, may there be neither dew nor rain upon you, nor upsurgings of the deeps. Upon you lie begrimed the warrior's shields, the shield of Saul, no longer anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the bodies of the valiant, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, or the sword of Saul return unstained. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and cherished, separated neither in life nor in death. Swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, women of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and in finery, who decked your attire with ornaments of gold. How can the warriors have fallen in the thick of the battle, slain upon your heights? I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. Most dear you have been to me. More precious have I held love for you than love for women. How can the warriors have fallen? The weapons of war have perished."
Okay. Thank you very much. I thought you did a great job. What do you guys think?
Good job.
Thank you.
Good job.
She even pronounced the words. She even pronounced the words right.
I don't know about that.
Close enough for us.
Yeah. Sounds good to me.
Okay, so basically to wrap this up in a nutshell, I guess, Samuel, who was, like the last judge, turned out that he was the guy that kind of oversaw the transition from this loose tribal contingents to a unified monarchy. And he had the job of picking the very first unified commander or leader of the United Monarchy, and that was Saul. And we talked about why he picked Saul and so forth. So Saul was the first anointed leader of Israel, of all the Israelite tribes together. And then after Saul's death, he picked David. David tired very quickly of becoming a mercenary for the Philistines after what happened to Saul and Saul's son Jonathan. When that happened, David said, "I've had enough of the Philistines." He came back to Judah and the Israelites, and he quickly became the second anointed king of the Israelites. And that's where we'll pick up next week. We'll be focusing on the United Monarchy. So this week was to get us past the period of the judges and to the beginning of the United Monarchy. That's it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me turn off the